Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a massive topic, one that impacts every single country, but most of us only ever see a tiny piece of it. We're talking about how criminal justice actually works globally. We're going to pull back the curtain on this really intricate system, from your local courthouse right up to major international bodies, and give you the real breakdown. Our mission to sort of untangle these layers, explore the institutions, the principles, and equip you with a concise understanding of how justice gets administered worldwide. Okay, let's unpack this.
Absolutely. And it's more than just a legal topic, too, isn't it? Understanding these systems is, I think, fundamental for anyone who cares about fairness, accountability, and human rights on a global scale. The way justice is administered, or sometimes how it's not administered, that impacts us all in pretty profound ways.
That's a really critical point. So just to anchor our discussion, when we talk about the administration of criminal justice, what are the core processes, the institutions involved?
Well, at its core, it's really about the mechanisms society's put in place.
Yeah.
To detect crime, investigate it, prosecute offenders, and ultimately address the criminal behavior. It's not just one thing. It's a complex ecosystem. Law enforcement, courts, corrections. They're all part of it.
And that phrase, complex ecosystem, that feels key. Because it doesn't just stop at a nation's borders, does it?
No, absolutely not.
These systems are interconnected, they overlap, and, they often face very different challenges depending on whether they're operating locally or, globally.
Precisely. And that interaction, that interplay between the national and the international levels, that's what makes this whole area so compelling and, frankly, sometimes so challenging.
Okay, well, let's start where most people have at least some familiarity. Within national borders, we're talking about what are often called ordinary courts.
Right, the standard ones.
Yeah, your sort of everyday judicial bodies handling everything from, traffic tickets right up to serious felonies. How are they typically set up?
You generally see a pretty clear hierarchy. You've got lower courts, think magistrate courts, district courts, that kind of thing. They handle the initial trials, the smaller offenses. Then, if there's a dispute over the verdict or how the law was applied, cases can move up.
To the higher courts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
High courts, Supreme Courts, whatever they're called in that particular system. They handle the appeals. You can sort of picture it like a ladder. Each rung gives another layer of review, helps ensure due process.
And while lots of systems have that kind of tiered structure, there's also quite a bit of diversity, right? Like take India, for example, a common law country. Their Supreme Court is at the top, then high courts, then subordinate district courts. They apply codes like the Indian Penal Code. But maybe in some civil law systems, you might see different kinds of specialized courts even lower down, like administrative courts.
That's right. The underlying legal philosophy definitely shapes the architecture. But that hierarchy, it isn't just for neatness. It's a really crucial mechanism for checks and balances. It ensures that justice isn't just a one-shot deal. It protects that fundamental right to appeal decisions, guarding against errors or potential abuses.
Okay, so we have these broad general courts, but here's where it gets really interesting, because justice isn't always a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Sometimes certain cases just don't fit that standard mold, do they? What makes us create these special courts? Why are they needed?
Well, special courts tend to pop up when the ordinary system, even with all its strengths, just isn't quite adequate for a specific task. They get established for particular types of cases or offenses that, demand specialized expertise or maybe a faster process or just a more focused approach. They often come about through specific legislation, really addressing particular societal needs that the general courts might struggle with.
I'm curious, what kind of cases need a whole new court? Can you give us some examples that really show this adaptability?
Sure. There's a range. You see fast-track courts, for instance. These are pretty common in places facing, say, significant judicial backlogs. Or maybe they need to speed up trials for really heinous crimes, like sexual offenses against children. They literally accelerate the process.
Just to get swifter justice.
Exactly. Then you have juvenile courts. These are maybe the most distinct. They operate on the principle that minors who conflict with the law need a fundamentally different approach. The focus shifts towards rehabilitation, developmental needs, not just punishment. You sometimes hear stories about judges in these courts taking a really active role, mentoring, following up years later. That's a very different kind of impact.
Definitely different from a standard criminal trial.
Right. And another really fascinating example, take India's National Green Tribunal. This body deals specifically with environmental cases, which can include criminal aspects. These cases require a deep understanding of environmental science and environmental law. knowledge that your average judge in a general court just wouldn't necessarily have.
So that adaptability you mentioned, it really shows how systems try to keep pace with changing needs, yeah. But speaking of fundamental needs, if these courts handle specific issues, what happens when it's not just about a specific crime type, but a deep violation of someone's basic human rights? How do our systems try to ensure that level of protection nationally and maybe internationally?
That's a huge question, and it takes us into, well, dedicated human rights mechanisms. Nationally, many states have bodies like state human rights commissions. Their job is to inquire into violations. Now, their powers are often recommendatory. They suggest actions rather than enforce them directly, but they play a vital role in investigation and advocacy.
Okay, so they raise awareness and push for action.
Precisely. And crucially, some systems, like India's again, go further and designate specific human rights courts at the district level. These are designed for swift trials of offenses specifically related to human rights violations. They're often presided over by a sessions judge. They provide a dedicated forum for victims of really severe violations, including extrajudicial killings, torture, state-sponsored abuse to seek justice.
That seems like a direct response to a very sensitive area, doesn't it? Especially when the state itself might be involved. Really drives home that need for accountability.
It absolutely does. If we connect this to the bigger picture, these courts are a direct response to the need for accountability in very sensitive areas, particularly when state actors might be involved.
Okay. But you mentioned earlier that justice also operates internationally. So what happens when crimes are just so severe, so widespread that they kind of transcend national borders, crimes that really affect all of humanity? Where does justice turn then?
That's exactly the gap the International Criminal Court, or ICC, was created to fill. It's a permanent international judicial body, set up by the Rome Statute back in 2002. Its very existence was a landmark moment, really. It signified a global commitment to address the absolute gravest crimes, the ones that, shock the conscience of humankind.
And what are the specific categories of crimes, the ones that fall under its jurisdiction?
The ICC focuses on 4 core international crimes. First, genocide. That's the deliberate, systematic extermination of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Second, crimes against humanity. These are widespread or systematic attacks against the civilian population, things like murder, extermination, enslavement, torture.
Okay.
Third, war crimes. These are grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and other serious violations of the laws and customs of war during armed conflict. And finally, the crime of aggression. This is about the use of armed force by one state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state.
That last one sounds particularly complex.
It is. Historically, it's been the most politically charged of the ICC's crimes. There are constant debates about, who really authorizes aggression and how you hold leaders accountable without potentially destabilizing international relations. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah, I can imagine. The theoretical definition versus the messy reality of global politics. Now, I've also heard the term complementarity used with the ICC. What does that actually mean in practice?
Complementarity. It's absolutely fundamental to how the ICC works. Essentially, it means the ICC is a court of last resort. So, if a country can and will genuinely investigate and prosecute these grave crimes within its own national system, even if it's slow or imperfect, the ICC steps back.
It complements the national systems, doesn't replace them.
Exactly. It only intervenes when national systems completely fail, or maybe deliberately refuse to act, perhaps because of a lack of political will or just genuine incapacity. And this raises an important question. How do international and national systems truly interact, especially with this principle? Because determining unwillingness or inability, that can be incredibly contentious, very political. It often becomes a real point of tension between international justice and national sovereignty.
I see. So the court can start investigations itself or through referrals.
That's right. It can initiate investigations on its own prosecutor's initiative, or it can receive a referral from a member state, or even from the United Nations Security Council.
Wow. That really does highlight that delicate dance between international justice and national sovereignty. So with all these different courts, different levels, national, special, international, how do we ensure some kind of baseline? A baseline of fairness, of human decency across the whole globe. It feels like we need some universal guiding principles.
And we absolutely do. That's where international norms on the administration of criminal justice come in. They play a really pivotal role. They shape national systems by promoting fairness, upholding human rights, and reinforcing the rule of law. Think of them as the global blueprints, the kind of shared understanding of how justice should be administered in a way that respects basic human dignity.
Okay, blueprints for justice. What are some of the most significant examples, documents or principles that have really shaped justice systems around the world?
Well, a truly foundational document is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR. Article 10, for example, clearly states that everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. And Article 11 establishes the presumption of innocence, innocent until proved guilty. These are absolute bedrock principles, non-negotiable.
Right, the fundamentals.
Then you have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR. This gets more detailed. Its Article 14 outlines specific rights in criminal proceedings, the right to a public hearing, legal assistance, the right to appeal, and so on. It fleshes out those UDHR principles, and we absolutely cannot overlook the Geneva Convention.
For wartime situations.
Exactly. They establish crucial norms for the humane treatment of prisoners of war and civilians during armed conflict. They explicitly prohibit torture and other inhumane treatment. Violating these norms constitutes war crimes. So, taken together, these documents and norms guide countries. They help them develop laws and procedures that protect fundamental rights throughout the entire criminal justice process.
Okay, so these documents, they lay out the big overarching principles, the ideals, but what about the more practical side? The sort of day-to-day guidelines for how justice is actually administered on the ground. How do we translate those high-level ideals into concrete actions for, say, police officers or prison guards?
That's a great point, and that's where UN General Assembly resolutions become incredibly important. Now, technically, they aren't legally binding in the same way treaties are, but they carry significant moral and political authority. They function as soft law.
Soft law.
Yeah, meaning they promote and codify international standards, and they profoundly influence what states actually do their practices and how international law itself develops over time. They set expectations.
Can you give us a few concrete examples of these resolutions and the kind of impact they've had?
Certainly. One very influential set is the Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners. You might know them as the Nelson Mandela Rules. These provide really comprehensive international guidelines on treating prisoners humanely and managing prisons properly. The goal is ensuring basic human rights are respected even behind bars. What's fascinating here, though, is the gap between the standard and the reality. They represent a global gold standard, but their effectiveness, that depends entirely on individual states actually implementing them. So you see huge disparities worldwide.
Right, from model facilities to places where the rules are barely acknowledged.
Sadly, yes. Another crucial one is the Code of Conduct for law enforcement officials. This sets out ethical principles for police, for other officials. It emphasizes upholding human dignity, using force only when absolutely necessary. And then there are the basic principles on the independence of the judiciary. These outline protections to keep judges free from undue influence, which is obviously fundamental for any fair system.
Absolutely critical for impartiality.
Exactly. So what's fascinating here is the power of this soft law and these shared values. They act as benchmarks, encouraging states or at least giving advocates leverage to push states to align their own systems with global human rights standards.
That's a fantastic overview. It really paints a picture of this layered system. So what does this all mean for us, for you listening? It means understanding that justice isn't just local. It's a truly global endeavor. There are many hands, many institutions working or supposed to be working to keep those scales balanced. From your local magistrate right up to the ICC, it's complex, layered, and constantly adapting. Wow, what a journey we've taken today, seriously. From those foundational national courts handling everyday stuff through the specialized courts for specific issues like juvenile justice or environmental crime, and those dedicated human rights courts, all the way to the really far-reaching international criminal court tackling the worst global atrocities. And underpinning it all, those essential international norms and UN resolutions that guide and shape how justice should be done worldwide. This deep dive, I think it really offers a shortcut to being well-informed about a critical and, yeah, pretty complex global system.
It really is a system that's constantly evolving, isn't it? It's always facing new challenges. Cybercrime, transnational terrorism, environmental crimes getting more focus.
Yeah.
And it's constantly navigating that inherent tension, the tension between national sovereignty, a state's right to govern itself, and that universal call for human rights protection. But despite all the complexities, all the debates and shortcomings, the shared goal, at least aspirationally, remains protecting human dignity and pursuing justice for everyone.
That's a great final thought. And knowing all this, maybe when you next read about a court case, whether it's local or international or an incident involving human rights, consider not just what happened, but which part of this vast global justice system is engaged. How are those international norms we talked about being applied or maybe interpreted differently? And perhaps what are the underlying challenges in that specific case to achieving that universal ideal of justice? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.